Hello, how are you?
Hi, doing well. How are you doing, Gary?
I am doing great.
Good. Welcome.
Your screen says Justin.
Yes. So Justin Nelson is from Trend Micro, and
Okay,
so is our speaker. And so I'm using his
I see.
computer to launch the meeting while he's finishing up another meeting.
Cool.
So I'm Jennifer.
Jennifer, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Hello, guys.
Hey, welcome.
Just going to admit that I've jumped in and out of so many meetings today that I was just reading the meetup description again to figure out where I was.
Hey, Jennifer, can you hear me?
I can. Hey, Caroline.
Okay, good. Hey, how are y'all?
Doing well. So I'm gonna go take my lunch off the stove really quickly. I'll be right back.
All right. Yeah, I figure we'll give everyone a little while to get logged in. Hey, Greg, thanks for joining.
So hey everybody, welcome to our meetup. As we're waiting for everybody to get in, I'm going to post a quick poll. One thing that Caroline and I talked about was really finding out what roles you all play at your companies so that we could better tailor this presentation to your needs and what you're interested in. And so I'm going to post that, and it's just a quick question about the role that you have in your company.
Yeah, and feel free to choose more than one of the options. I know some people kind of work in cross-functional roles, so, let us know what you're doing. And even, you can put in there stuff that you've done in the past, so I know kind of where everyone's knowledge is.
So thought the poll was pre-set up, but it's looking like I need to populate it. So I'm just going to redo that quickly.
Yeah, no worries. We've got 15 people in, and I think 30 something had signed up, so we'll give people some more time anyways to jump on.
Hey, Caroline, it's Greg. Just a quick note to all the participants out there. It looks like you're muted upon entering the Zoom, so you'll have to unmute yourself on Zoom and your phone when you want to speak.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg. And also, I'm going to apologize. I'll probably be coughing some. I've been sick with something other than what's in the news, but have been sick nonetheless. And also, as we move through the presentation, I'm going to try and pay attention to the chat window. If anyone has any questions, I really would love for this to be as interactive as possible. So Gussie, got a chat coming through there. Everyone should be able to see that. But if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. If I don't get to the chat, then Jennifer also said that she would keep an eye out for that and kind of speak up so I don't miss anything that y'all may want to add to the presentation or ask of me as I go through the slides.
Absolutely. Thanks, Caroline.
On the DP, I just want to be clear, are you saying that the administration is requiring these industries to create these products or just asking?
So far we haven't had to. It's an amazing thing that happened. We're getting calls from automobile companies, we're getting calls from other companies saying they have plant capacity, they want to make ventilators, they want to make other things. We are literally being, this in a beautiful way, by companies that want to do the work, they want to do the job, they want to help us, they want to help our country. So we haven't had a problem with that at all.
Hey, William, I think you might not be muted there. I think we're getting some feedback from you. All right, sounds good.
All right. So I've got this poll. Hopefully, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to launch this poll, just asking you to describe your current role. If you don't see what you do listed there, just put it in the chat. We could only do 10 options, and so that's all I could fit in, but feel free to post your role in the chat. And if you're just joining us, welcome. I'll get going with introductions and all of that in a few minutes. Just wanted to give everyone a chance to join and to complete the poll. This is going to help Caroline better tailor her talk today toward what you guys are interested in and what roles you play at your companies.
Nice, the Phoenix Project's great. For any of y'all who have read that, thanks Steve for sharing that. And Jennifer, I don't know, I have not read the Unicorn Project yet. It's on my list, so. Jennifer, I don't know how you go about sharing the results of that poll. I think you're, at least now, the only one that can see anything coming in.
Okay, I'll take a look at that once I end it. I'll make sure to send it your way somehow.
Yep, no worries. Yeah, even if you just want to, you know, screenshot it, email it, or shoot a text with the picture.
Sure.
Cool. Even so far in the chat, looks like we've got a pretty good spectrum of people that are joining, and that's kind of what this is all about. So I'm excited. So I also want to thank everyone for joining. I know that a lot of the perks of these meetups are that we get to be face to face and get some free food and stuff. And, you know, with everything that's going on, I know not really anyone can do that now. So I appreciate y'all still hopping on and joining so we can get some good information shared done today.
Absolutely. So I'll go ahead and kick us off. Feel free to continue filling out that poll. It looks like most people, Caroline, are posting in the chat. In the poll, we just have for people, and it's front end and back end developers. So pretty wide variety of interest and experience, which is great. So thank you all for joining. And just to give you a little background on BASE, if this is your first BASE meetup, BASE is Birmingham, Alabama Software Enthusiasts. And a few years ago, we tried to consolidate all of the technologist-related meetups into one umbrella, or at least many of them, so that you could go to one place to find out about events in Birmingham related to technology. And so we have events ranging from just social events once a month to roundtables on a variety of topics. I host a React Lunch and Learn once a month, and we have a UI UX meetup once a month. And so we're constantly looking to add new things and hear from all of you. So if you've got an idea of something that you'd like to talk about or do an event around, let us know. We're on Magic City Tech Slack on the BASE channel. I'm Jennifer Nelson, despite what my name might say at the bottom of this. I'm using a different computer, but I would love to hear from you, and we're so glad that you're joining us today. So I have the honor of presenting Caroline Ratliff, and she is a DevOps engineer, security engineer with Trend Micro. And I'll let her tell you a little bit more about herself, but we're so glad that she's here, and I will turn it over to Caroline.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. I like to make sure, because every now and then you'll get talking and it won't have shared through. Excuse me. Awesome. So just got the poll results as well. So it looks like we've got a good bit of people in security and people in development, but not really anyone in operations. So that's interesting. But today, my presentation, kind of the main topic is the term shifting left. Some of y'all may have heard that. Steve, yes, we are recording. So we're talking about shifting left, and shifting left kind of has two different implications in what I'm going to talk about today. One of those being DevOps and one of those being DevSecOps. So I think most of y'all have heard about DevOps, especially from what people have said in the chat. And then DevSecOps may be a little bit newer to some of y'all. You may have heard the word, but not really heard as much about what it is. So before getting into the meat of this presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about myself and who I am. I was a mathematician in a past life. That's my degree. I went to school for all different kinds of engineering disciplines and realized that I just liked the math portion of it. So that's what I went for, and actually came out of school in a software role. So some of you that are developers on here may understand this a little bit, but I started at Seagate and took a position where I would be writing device drivers in C for SSDs. And on my 5th day of work out of college, they moved me into a cloud role. And so that's kind of where my cloud and DevOps work gets started. So there, I learned a lot about cloud computing, did a lot of systems engineering, systems administration, moved into DevOps. I've been a DevOps engineer on call, which I miss doing hands-on stuff with DevOps a lot, but I do not miss being on call, and I'm sure a lot of y'all can relate to that. But I did a lot of work with databases in those positions, and then actually moved into professional development and course development. And there, I really upped my networking background, and then my most recent job is here at Trend Micro. And Trend, we are a security company. We have in the past been more of an endpoint security company, but have been making big strides into hybrid cloud security and DevOps security. So I have joined here as a sales engineer. I support the North Carolina, the state of North Carolina, but I'm on the Southeast team, so that's why I'm here at the Birmingham event. I do support different account managers all throughout the Southeast, but just to give you all that background so you understand, I kind of have a very broad range of things that I've worked on in my past. And then here is typically where, if we weren't in person, I would like to kind of get a feel for who everyone is, but we went ahead and got that done. If you haven't looked through the chat, we have a pretty diverse group of people on the call today. We have several people that are in agile positions, agile coach positions. We have people who are starting in DevOps, people who have been in DevOps for a while, people who are just now getting into coding, whether that is front end or back end. And then we have some people who are in security as well. So I don't really see anyone on here that is doing anything particularly like strictly in operations, but we do have some people in DevOps, so that's good. All right, so shifting left, what does shifting left mean? All right, so when we talk about development, operations, and security, think of development as being the furthest left. So whether we're talking about ops, moving ops into the development space, or security and moving security into the DevOps space. So when we shift ops left into DevOps, then we get, or I'm sorry, excuse me, when we shift ops into development, we get DevOps. And when we shift security over into dev and to DevOps, we get DevSecOps. So here's a little comic relief, at least my attempt at it for everyone stuck at home. But when we talk about traditional IT, we really talk about all of these three different teams being siloed, right? We have development, developers, whether we're talking UX, front end, back end. We have people in operations, systems administrators, people who are database administrators, network engineers, and then we have security. So I'll give you all a second to read through these comics a little bit, but I had fun finding these for y'all. All right. So moving away from traditional IT, we'll start by talking about DevOps. And DevOps is, again, taking the development pieces, building, testing code, and the ops piece, which is deploying, releasing, and operating that code in production. And when we talk about DevOps, no matter who you talk to, you probably will get a different definition of what DevOps is. And the reason that that is because it's more so a culture shift. So it's allowing everyone to be responsible and everyone to have a say. And when you give everyone a say in what's going on, then you get a different definition from every person and from every angle. So we take those 3 siloed teams and we move them into DevOps, which, as you can see, is our dev team and our ops team working together. Instead of having a group of people that are trying to create new features and bug fixes in one silo, and then sending that information over to our ops team, who then doesn't have much of a clue of what's actually going on in the software and putting that into production. Everyone's working together. Everyone knows what the other team is doing, and it makes it much easier to be able to get those fixes out there and those features out there. But with DevOps, we still have the security group over here, and this is one of my favorite of the comics that I found, because this is kind of one of the biggest things when you're in DevOps, and I'm sure a lot of y'all have experienced, but the security engineers saying, man, the security is so great, you won't even be able to get to it, right? And that's kind of why a lot of people in the DevOps and DevOps space try to kind of steer away from working with security, because it really makes their jobs a lot harder. But don't get me wrong, security is important, but when people have strict deadlines for feature releases and getting bug fixes out, security really does hamper development and release a lot. So now that we've talked about the culture bit that goes along with DevOps, why do we want to do this, right? So we talked about how we have developers who are developing the code, and we have people in operations who are deploying the code. And the ultimate goal here is to get new features and bug fixes out faster, right? And when the 2 teams work together and can come up with repeatable and reliable processes for that development and deployment, then we're able to meet that quick turnaround time for getting stuff into production. And ultimately, it comes down to everyone is responsible for this. So instead of having developers saying, oh, well, it works fine on my laptop, it must be an issue with the production environment because it was working here. Everyone works together. People are thinking much earlier before things are getting to production, so we're not finding issues later on during the process. Before I move on, does anyone have any questions? All right, so we talked about why DevOps exists, why organizations are moving that way, right? Getting features out as fast as possible because that's the way to stay relevant in the market. But we also have to know how this is happening, right? What tools are being used in order to accomplish those DevOps culture shifts. So I'll go through each of these individually, but the first one is CI/CD. And y'all may have heard that as a buzzword. It's a pretty big one within the DevOps community, but this is for continuous integration and continuous delivery. It's often referred to as continuous deployment as well. And that's really continuous delivery versus continuous deployment is really a philosophical debate, but just getting to learn DevOps, just knowing that really it's talking about getting stuff out to production on a continuous basis. So most of you, especially those who have worked in development, have worked with all sorts of version control and change control tools, and a very popular one being Git. So Git is, if I had to guess a number, I would say 90+% of organizations working with DevOps are solely using Git for their source control, right? But instead of just pushing code changes to Git now, we're using that, that push to take this tool called Jenkins, which, if you haven't heard of Jenkins, Jenkins is essentially just a task manager. It's just running, and you can have it do pretty much anything that you want it to. You just have to be able to write a script, and you can go in and run tasks manually, or in this case, you can have a code change that is pushed in Git to kick off tasks in Jenkins. So a full CI/CD pipeline would look like a developer making a change, pushing that change out to any production or testing, or any testing branch or staging branch. Jenkins would then go off and do things such as running automated testing, and then you can also have it do certain things based on what the results of those tests are. And this is also going to be based upon how mature your CI/CD pipeline is. So if you're just starting to get into DevOps in your organization, you may want to just have Jenkins push that code to a staging environment until you have more confidence in your automated testing and all of your automated processes there. But very mature DevOps organizations will have it to where a developer pushes a change in Git, Jenkins runs the tests, and then pushes that straight out to production. Right. Automation and orchestration is also another tool that is heavily used in DevOps organizations. Most of you probably know about scripting. Scripting is nothing new. Bash scripting, if you know about Linux, this is the born again shell. This is actually just going in and running system commands in a file and then running that file. So having things done automatically. In the past, I'll say 5-10 years, Python has taken off as a little bit more robust scripting language, especially when you're trying to include other types of coding concepts such as loops and classes and functions and the sort, right? But where DevOps kind of takes off on this concept of automation is within configuration management. So for example, if you wanted to script the deployment of a database server that you may need for an application, you could write a Python script that would install all of the packages that you need, set up all of the networking that you need, open ports, get the software up and running, set passwords, things like that, right? And that's great, but the thing that configuration management offers above and beyond scripting is the ability to dissociate the operating system, the version of the operating system, the version of whatever application that you're trying to run. And so say with Puppet, you can, it's actually its own separate language. You can say, I want this server to run this version of Postgres and have this password for this database. And you kick it off and it runs, and it knows what to do in order to be able to do all of the things that, say, a Python script you wrote yourself would do. Are there any questions on configuration management? All right. Thank you, Lawrence. right? So also within automation and orchestration, we have infrastructure as code. This is probably less likely that some of you have heard of this, but this is one of the things that really allows for those final steps of the CI/CD pipeline. So with infrastructure as code, we basically have let me check this. William will answer that question in a little bit, but don't let me forget, and I'll get to you. With infrastructure as code, we just define, like we would in any programming language, we define what our virtual infrastructure is going to look like. So, for example, we have AWS CloudFormation, which is specific for AWS, but Terraform can be used in any environment, be it VMware, OpenStack, AWS. So it is kind of cloud or, on-prem or public cloud, kind of agnostic there. But essentially you could have a Terraform script that said you wanted this many servers that were running this operating system based off of this base image. You want them to have this number of ports on them, this number of hard drives. And so it makes creating your infrastructure able to be automated and coded, just like the configuration of your infrastructure and thus the code that's running on top of it. So those three things together kind of all make that CI/CD pipeline possible. All right, and then another tool or concept that's big in DevOps is microservices and APIs. So for those of you who have been in development, you probably know the term monolith. If you have not heard that term, essentially that is, this diagram here depicts a monolithic code base. So you have your user interacting with one giant code base. Every developer is writing code in that same code base, and you're just using things like functions and classes to try and separate what's in the code, and typically all accessing one large data store. Okay. And microservices attempts to break up that code into, so say you have functions that do things like login, your cart, a catalog, just breaks that up into the different functions that you are doing in the monolith and runs each of those in a separate code base. And this is why, going back to, well, let me go back. All right, going back to our CI/CD pipeline, pushing a code change, running tests, and pushing that change out to production. If you have one giant code base, then it's much easier to have small changes affect a completely different part of the code. Whereas if you have smaller services, then you changing the definition of a certain function is less likely to have an effect on the other parts of your application. And the way that this works is by communication with APIs. If you're not familiar with APIs, that is short for Application Programming Interface. And what it does is when you have a large code base, essentially you have functions and you have objects, and that's how your code communicates within itself. But with the services, say you have a service that loads a page, but it needs information from the catalog. Within a monolithic code base, it would reach for that from within the same code base. Here, your page service would issue an API call, or it's just an HTTP call, to the catalog service and say, hey, I need this information, right? So it separates all of those different functionalities. And another big advantage here is that instead of having one large data store, like one giant Postgres or MySQL database, you can have multiple data stores. That makes data access and storing much more efficient. Right, and then kind of the last main topic here that I have to talk about in DevOps is containers and serverless computing. So I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with working with virtual machines. So if you look at this diagram here, the way that we use virtual machines is we have our physical hardware with the host operating system. On top of that, we have our hypervisor, which allows us to create virtual hardware in which we install another operating system and then install applications on top of that that can then run our code. Right? This is a great development from having to have separate physical hardware for every application, but it also does have a lot of middleware here that can be very heavyweight, especially when you're running small applications. Moving on to containers. With containers, instead of having a hypervisor, we have this container engine. And what that allows is allows the different containers to actually access the host's operating system for different things that it may need to do, as opposed to having to have that other level of guest operating system running. So they're a lot more lightweight and they're a lot faster. Then we move on to serverless, and with serverless, we don't even have to break this up into separate applications, right? Where the container engine is going to be kind of physically isolating the applications that we're running. The serverless runtime actually will use applications that are running on the physical hardware. And so we don't even have to separate them by apps. We can just run individual functions, and we lose even more of that middleware that we were having to run previously. And now, of course, serverless, you're not going to be able to have state data like you can when you're running your own application. So it certainly has the places where it works best and not, but it is a really great advantage for certain things that you would do within an application. Now, before I move on to DevSecOps, does anybody have any questions, comments, anything they would like to add just in terms of DevOps? At what point would you need API gateways to manage the API calls? So that's just going to depend on how large your infrastructure is, right? So typically you would have the service would be able to manage its own API calls. If you were running, say you were running all of this in AWS, as opposed to creating your own API gateway or having your service manage its API calls itself, that's when you would want to bring an API gateway in. So it's kind of, and that's one of the nice things about cloud computing and specifically using public cloud like AWS or Azure, is that you can kind of manage the level of things that you want to do yourself and the level of things that you want to outsource to that company. Any other questions before I move on? You're welcome, Shivam. All right, so now moving on to DevSecOps. Right, so similar thoughts here with Dev and Ops, right? We've got development that is coding and testing the code that we need for our different applications, and then we have operations that is actually releasing and deploying and continuing to operate that code. And instead of having security out here on the side, security is intended to be involved throughout the entire process. All right. So before, where we had our 3 siloed teams, they weren't working together. We moved with the culture shift of DevOps into the developers and the people in operations working together, but security still sitting there and saying, okay, well, we're going to make your data as hard to access as possible so it's secure. We now have this culture shift to bring security to the table. And just like it was required that developers and people in operations made the decision to sit down together and work together, the same thing has to happen within DevSecOps. So we have this unparalleled velocity that DevOps has given organizations, but we also need to manage the risk because, yes, it's very important to get new features and bug fixes out to production, especially in the landscape we're in now. My favorite example there is that I used Netflix for a long time. After a while, I switched to Hulu because there was just some shows that Hulu had that Netflix didn't have. So I canceled Netflix, moved to Hulu, and Hulu was crashing all the time. So I went straight back to Netflix, right? So you have this ease of movement within the market, and you don't want to lose that velocity to make changes to fix bugs. But also the security landscape is more threatening than ever, right? So yeah, let's get out new features as soon as possible, but we also don't want to be that company that gets out that feature first and then gets hacked and releases all of their employees or all of their customers' data. All right, so why do we want to shift security left? This is just very similar to the creation of DevOps. Adding security into DevOps is the same as adding operations into development. We want to fix our security holes earlier. We want to get we want to find the security holes earlier. And if they do happen to get out into production, we want to get the fixes out there quicker, right? If security is involved with the development team, the operations team, and DevOps teams, and actually come and meet them where they're at, as opposed to trying to say, this is how we do security. Trying to work together, you're going to be able to integrate and be able to find the security holes, right? And if security teams do not do this, if security teams continue to stick to that mindset, then the developers, the DevOps teams are just going to go rogue. They're going to go behind their back and they're going to get the features out there that when they have to, because they're given timelines. With DevSecOps, we're saying, look, everyone is responsible for security. Even if you're not a security engineer, if you're a developer and you're writing code and you put out a new feature and that feature allows a data breach, you still have a sense of responsibility there, right? So it really does benefit everyone throughout the whole team to work together instead of continuing to stay siloed and insist that everything is done in their own way. All right, and as far as developers and DevOps teams going rogue, a lot of very large companies are just absolutely floored when they find out how much of their infrastructure is actually running out in public clouds when it's their policy that that's not allowed. And so if the security engineers at those companies will attempt to come and meet the developers and the DevOps engineers at their table, then that's the way that we can fix that issue. All right, and so again, why do we want to do DevSecOps? We also have to know how we do DevSecOps, right? So in order to bring security to where developers and DevOps engineers are at, security has had to create tools that integrate into CI/CD pipelines that work with all of the different new types of infrastructure and open source code that that DevOps teams are using. So let's see, we got a question. All right, is anyone having trouble hearing me?
Oh, all good here.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay. All right, Chris, is that any better? Okay. All right, thanks, Chris. Just wanted to make sure. All right, so how we talked about containers earlier, right? There are just a few things that we have to do a little bit different with containers than virtual machines. For deploying a virtual machine, you're going to go through the whole installation process. This takes time to get out there. The virtual machine has to be provisioned. But with containers, we often have images in a repository that are ready to go and can be up and running in production within minutes. So when we have images that are out there that literally can be in production in minutes, we want to make sure that those images are secure. And so whenever there are different tools, and on each of these slides, I have some of the tools kind of listed here. There are lots of tools out there. These are a lot of new technologies, so a lot of players in the market right now. But these are just, you know, if you want to check it out, these are just several different ones that are out there. But for these, essentially, you create a new container image, then you upload that image into the repository, your container repository. That image can be scanned, and then there can also be real-time scanning of your repository. So if anything was to get corrupted or anything was to be replaced without people's knowledge, you would be able to find those vulnerabilities as well. And then we also have to worry about runtime protection for containers. So for those of you who are familiar with workload security for servers, so just any server that's out there running code, we have the security measures in place to protect that as it's running. We also have to have those same things in place for containers. Right, and then we also have open source code security. So for all of you developers, I think we all can agree code has bugs. It just does. No code is perfect. Part of coding is finding bugs and fixing bugs. And there are a lot of huge benefits of using open source code, but just like any other code, there are bugs in it as well. But one of the good things about open source code is that since more people are using the code, more people are finding the bugs. So there are new tools out there that allow for us to actually check our code, especially the open source code that we may be using within our applications, and using the database of known bugs to tell us when we need to update or patch anything before we actually put open source code out into production. Right, and then we also have cloud infrastructure security. So when we talk about DevOps, you do not have to be using cloud or public cloud for that matter to be able to implement DevOps tools. You can be running all of your applications in VMware on-prem and still take a lot of these culture aspects and tools into place. But if you are using cloud, there are a lot of things to consider that we do consider when we're talking about our physical data centers. And so now there are tools that are coming out to help us with the aspects of that virtual infrastructure. Not only do we have to worry about the security, but when you think about a physical data center, you go out and you buy a certain type of server. It costs a certain amount of money, but that's much more variable when we're using cloud infrastructure. We can change how many cores are on whatever server we're using. We can bring up more servers and stuff. So there are tools out there that don't just allow us to make sure that the ports are configured correctly or that firewalls are set up correctly, but also securing us from overspending, as well as compliance. So if you are taking in any credit card data, right, a lot of these tools will tell you if your infrastructure is PCI compliant. And one other thing out there as well is template scanning. So how I talked about infrastructure as code with CloudFormation and Terraform, there are scanners where you can go ahead, take the template that you have written to bring up your infrastructure and run it through that, and it can go ahead and do the analysis that you would get once you already have your infrastructure out there. All right, and then last but not least, we have runtime application self-protection, or RASP for short. This is probably the thing on the list that I have heard about the most recent. So a lot of you may not have heard about it before. There are a lot of devs in here, so I may be off base on that a little bit. But what's cool about RASP is when we have network security or a lot of the security tools that we use, we look at packet inspection. So we're looking at the network layer. But once our network traffic gets to our application, we have a much more visibility into what that traffic is actually attempting to do. So this just gives us another layer of protection. We can actually see what that, that HTTP call is attempting to do. And these tools can run in physical infrastructure, in virtual infrastructure, in containers, but most recently are being extended to be an extra layer within serverless environments. And so it's kind of really a big deal when it comes to serverless, because serverless is where you have the least control over the security of your code and where your code is running. So if y'all are using or looking into using serverless, I would definitely suggest looking into RASP technologies. And that is all I have for actual presentation. Happy to answer questions or have anyone give any additional input. Again, everyone's thoughts are valid here, so feel free to share. What skill sets would you need to get into DevOps versus DevSecOps? And you had kind of asked this a little bit earlier, how do you get into DevOps? I think that joining talks like this, doing research on the internet is going to be the best way to get started. There is not just a lot of DevOps and DevSecOps engineers sitting out there waiting to get hired. And so I think that you know, anyone that has just the base knowledge and showing the initiative of attempting to learn these technologies, going into interviews, going into, you know, putting in cover letters, et cetera, saying, hey, this is what I want to do. I have the desire to do this. I find it interesting. I've already spent time researching it. Any company that's smart enough will look at that. I really think that that's your best bet. A good starting place for a developer who wants to level up their DevOps knowledge. There are a lot of really good sites out there that have free classes online, like Coursera. I can send to Jennifer some, I'm going to make a note of that. I'll send some links to Jennifer with some places where you can follow up. There were some articles in the initial invitation that she sent out. I'll have her include those, but I'll also try and send some good courses that are free out there to help as well.
Thanks, Caroline. And I'll also, we recorded this talk, and so I'll post this on Slack as and send it out in the meetup as well afterward with those links.
Okay. And it looks like Steve has a question. I think we've got a couple more minutes. Steve, what's your question?
Are you getting my audio?
Yep.
Good. Okay. So early on, you said that the development part was the furthest left phase, and I was thinking about going even further left, which is actually kind of reflected in that figure 8 diagram. So once the code is out there, you're monitoring it, and then people are going to have new requests, and that's going to feed back into new code. And then in some cases, that's going to be the initial, outset of developing a thing for the very first time. What are the implications of, we've blended the wall between dev and ops. What about blending the wall between, say, biz dev? What are the implications for dev and ops and security that would be lessons learned or tips or things to watch out for, or ways that would help everybody in the process at the earliest stage where you're doing, requirements gathering or, feature or story creation, things like that from the business customer?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And, I think that the creation of DevOps really kind of started with the Agile movement. So I think that our biz dev is relatively involved here, but as opposed to biz dev sitting down with developers, biz dev is now sitting down with developers and people in operations. But I'm really glad that you pointed that out, because I do think that that's something that's not necessarily always shared. But from my place and where I've been, it's kind of implied. But I think it's great for, go ahead.
I was going to say, from my point of view, I think it's easier to get the dev and the ops and the sec worlds to talk to each other because they have so much in common in terms of code and how they think. And there's a much harder break between, say, managers or business developers or users or customers, and then the technical people that are going to create solutions for them.
Certainly. I think that, that DevOps and DevSecOps does try and attempt to get the developers and the operators and the security engineers to think past just the technical aspect of what they're doing. All right. When you're in operations and all you're concerned about is getting a server out there with this code that a developer has given you, you're not thinking about what that feature is or what that person wants. But when you're actually involved with a developer and understanding more so what they're trying to do, and making sure that things work together, it does just increase that awareness of the entire company as opposed to that little box that you sit in. But I do think that there is a lot of value in having company-wide discussions about DevOps and having biz dev and product management people come to those discussions and be involved in that as well. Anybody else have questions?
All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, thank you so much, Caroline, for talking with us about this today. Yeah, and all of you out there, please reach out if you've got an idea for a virtual talk while we're all stuck indoors. So we want to keep the community going, keep conversations going, keep learning going. And so I'm Jennifer Nelson on Magic City Tech Slack, and you can find me on the meetup group as well, on the base meetup group. And I will follow up with links and the video of this presentation. Please share, and we'll see you guys next time.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks.